Okay, I want to welcome everybody to this next installment in the Housing, Equity, and Community lecture series, done remotely as it has been for the past year or so, unfortunately, due to COVID. But this one, the Future of LA's Transit-Oriented Communities, or TOC program, is about to get started. And I'm Mike Manville. I am an associate professor of urban planning at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs, and I am the moderator and a brief presenter for today's program. And let me quickly introduce the panelists that I'll be sharing the remote stage with, and then I'll talk a little bit about what the basic gist of the program is going to be, and then we will get going. So as I mentioned, I'm Mike Manville, but joining me today and the stars of the show are Alex Pratt, who is a multifamily housing developer with AmCal and Amtex, doing a combination of affordable and market rate housing, but mostly affordable housing. So he's here for his expertise in that regard. We're also joined by Matthew Glesne, who is a senior planner with the Los Angeles City Planning Department. And for our purposes, what's important, he's the chief housing planner and had a strong role as an architect of the Transit-Oriented Communities program. And then last but certainly not least is Laura Raymond, who is the executive director of the Alliance for Community Transit LA, better known to many people as ACT LA, an advocacy group that does a lot of important work around transportation and housing affordability, and had a big role, as we'll hear, in the formation, the original genesis of what became the TOC program. So before we jump to the next slide, let me just give you an overview of what we're going to discuss and how it's going to go. So the purpose of this event is that the TOC program turns 5 this year. And in the 5 years since it's been around, it's probably become the city's most popular, or one of the most popular, housing production tools. More than 35,000 housing units have been proposed, and about a quarter of those are reserved for low-income households, all of it within a half mile of what's known as high-quality transit. There's a lot in the program that's innovative for Los Angeles, innovative for California, including expedited approval processes, density bonuses, and setting aside more housing for extremely low-income households. But the program it's halfway through its sort of 10-year period. And so we thought this would be a good time to take stock of how it's going, what's been successful, where it could improve, talk about some criticisms of it, and so forth. And so the way this is going to go after we get through our next couple slides is that I'm going to turn the stage over to Matt Glesne, and he's going to give us an overview of the program and how it works. I will then take the stage back and very quickly summarize some research that we've done at the Lewis Center about it. Then Laura will talk about the genesis of it, and then we will go from there to a moderated discussion. We'll bring everyone in, bring Alex in, and then at the end of that, we have a pretty big crowd today, so hopefully you guys will have a lot of questions, and then I will just moderate an audience Q&A, which we'll use if you submit questions through the Zoom Q&A function. We'll try and get to as many of them as possible. So that's the way it's going to go. So, okay, next slide, please. So before we move on, very important, we just want to acknowledge, as we do at all of these events, that the traditional caretakers of the land that we're on are the Gabrielino Tongva people, and we pay our respects to those people and their elders as a land-grant institution, and bear in mind, that this is the land that we are on that is traditionally theirs. So thank you. Okay, next slide. And of course, we just want to acknowledge our funders. This lecture series, including the lecture we're in right now, is jointly funded by the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies and the UCLA Ziman Center for Real Estate. Okay. All right, and with that, let's kick this off. So Matt Glesne, I will mute myself and fade into the background while you take us on a tour through what the TOC is.
Yes, thank you, Michael, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matt Glesne. I am with the Department of City Planning, City of Los Angeles, do oversee our housing policy unit. And yeah, we'll just be kind of giving you an overview of just so you understand what the program is, sort of a little bit about how it came to be. Really want to acknowledge that that this what has ended up to be a really productive housing program, a very successful program in many ways, was given to us by Measure JJJ, a citizen initiative put forth by a number of groups, including ACT LA, one of our panelists here, Laura. We're going to hear probably a little bit more about the genesis, but certainly wouldn't be here and without others coming up with this idea in the first place. So yeah, it's just been, I can't believe it's been 5 years. Been reflecting a little bit about the early days of sort of, back 5 6 years ago, 2016, and to the extent folks were talking about these land use issues and zoning issues, it was often about you know zone changes and it's called spot zoning, and that measure JJJ a lot of people were focused on. If you remember, there was a competing measure S that was a little more anti-housing and anti-growth. This was sort of a counterweight, and I'll let Laura get into a little bit more of that. But I'm just reflecting that this little nugget, the TOC program, really wasn't the focus of a lot of people. I remember I actually looked at some old agendas with management and mayor's office and council, and sometimes this little nugget wasn't even in the agenda. Everyone was focused on other aspects, and I think most would agree that this has become probably the most impactful piece of that legislation. So yeah, so this was basically an initiative to give the planning department the authority to sort of develop some details about a transit-based affordable housing incentive program that would sort of, I think, counter some of the decreases in some of the zone change projects that were being affected by one part of the initiative, and to really say, hey, we want to grow, we want housing near our transit. Much of our planning is outdated here in Los Angeles. It hasn't kept up with the really amazing transit investments. And this could be a bridge to the future, really, is the way I kind of thought about it and was understood it. Is, let's just go a little bit bigger near our transit areas and really make sure we're also getting deeply affordable housing along with it. And so many of the provisions were outlined in Measure JJJ, but there was also some flexibility given to the department to craft some of those measures. And I think that was a really great model. Basically said, city planning, go create within 90 days, which was a daunting timeline, but I think helped focus our minds a little bit and give us 90 days to sort of come up with the details of exactly what kind of incentives, what are the eligibility criteria. Again, some of those were set in the JJJ and some of those were left to planning. We basically took it and ran with it. The sort of parameters are that, yes, this only applies in what are called major transit stops. So just to understand what that means, that's any rail, BRTs, bus rapid transit, have since been added to the definition of major transit stops. So now things like the Orange Line and the Silver Line are considered sort of rail, and half-mile radiuses are included. In addition to 2 bus lines that intersect. So 2 15-minute bus lines that intersect will also be considered a major transit stop and is in the program. Beyond that, we were asked to sort of develop a tier-based incentive system that, again, I think really smartly had 2 levels that developers can choose, whether they want to, what we ended up calling request just basic incentives or base. That would just be density, floor area, parking. Those are the big ones. Those are the ones we get the most requests for. Those can actually be requested through a by right process, and can go straight to building and safety and can be completely by right as long as they're not tripping over another threshold. We have site plan review for you zoning nerds out there. It ends up being about 75 units or more would have to be discretionary, but smaller projects can go completely by right. And then if you want to ask for more height, additional incentives, more height, setback relief, open space relief, things like that, then you are in a discretionary city of planning, but a pretty transparent kind of check the box process. But that does trigger CEQA discretion and all that. So yeah, we did have some discretion. I'm thinking we probably could. The planning, the city, the mayor, council, planning commission, those who had their fingers on this, sort of had a decision. We probably could have, looking back on it, not made the program as attractive and sort of, worthwhile as I think we ended up doing it. So I just want to acknowledge there was a lot of political support to making this real and making this really effective. And so, we went sort of big. And one way we kind of wrapped our head around that was to take the idea of transit stops and recognize there's significant differences in transit, right? Like a rail station downtown is much different than two sort of random bus lines in the valley. And we wanted to reflect those differences in the quality of transit, as well as the distance from the transit. So we came up with a sort of slightly wonky, but I think effective way to break these transit areas, these half-mile radiuses, into different tiers. So depending on the type of transit, is it rail? Do you have a rapid bus there? And then how far are you? We developed basically a 4-tier system, and that basically allowed us to increase our incentives to give more density, more parking relief if you are closer to higher quality transit. So that was, I think, one of the major sort of stamps that the planning department put on it. Ran that through our planning commission. They wanted to go even bolder, so they added a few more things through the process. One of the unique things and one of the real, I think, sort of dreams from a city planner point of view, maybe, is that this initiative, because it was voter initiated, did not need to go through the typical legislative city council approval process, which I'm sure not all of our city council members appreciated, but it did. But I know some did, and I saw some sort of appreciated not having to make a tough vote. Certainly led to, I think, a little more creativity and freedom and just speed as well. And not having to do a big CEQA. For those of you who know, the California Environmental Quality Act often adds a year long, adds all kinds of bells and whistles to an ambitious rezoning process like this. And so we didn't need those. We just had to sort of bring our proposal to Planning Commission, obviously consulted with the folks who wrote JJJ, consulted with folks who would be users of the program, but essentially carried this forward, and it was in effect within a matter of months. Just briefly, the results have been tremendous. 41,000 units, I think, is the latest number of approved. Almost more than 9,000 affordable units in 3 years. We've approved almost about 29,000 of those. The vast majority of market rate are building extremely low income units, which is very exciting. This is an income category that I don't think any real land use incentive programs in the country probably address. It's, of course, where the deepest needs are. Those the closest to homelessness, those living in the worst housing conditions. So that's super exciting. We are getting this very low $25,000 a year kind of income category, when often affordable housing, capital A, capital H, subsidized affordable housing, is not reaching those levels. So I see that as a real success of the program, and again, credit to the folks who designed that. But I'll leave it there. Hopefully understand a little bit about the program, where it came from, and happy to jump into questions later. So thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Matt. So let me jump off from where Matt left off and just present a little bit of some academic research that we've done here at UCLA about the TOC program, with a particular focus. And let me share my screen. So, one of the things that Matt mentioned that I think is very important, and I want to highlight a little bit, is that in addition to offering a lot of regulatory relief, that a developer could, under the TOC program, get more height, get less parking, maybe get less setbacks, things like that. It was easier for a market rate development or a mixed income development to be approved by right, which meant, as Matt talked about when he talked about the discretionary process, when he talked about CEQA, and I imagine there's a lot of sort of planning savvy people in the audience who know this, it adds a lot of time to development. And time is money in development, as in anything else. And so at the Lewis Center, we were looking at TOC and thinking that it offered a good way to test this kind of longstanding idea that the more you could move development approvals to ministerial or by right and away from discretionary, the more you would get a faster process. And first, before I jump into that, I just want to show a graphic that kind of highlights something Matt just said, which is the impact. This is just from the city planning's housing dashboard. The real impact that the TOC program has had on the composition of development proposed and approved in the city of Los Angeles. If you look, if you follow my cursor, you can see 2015, 2016. This was before TOC existed, and I think Laura will probably talk a little bit about this because she'll talk about Measure JJJ, which kind of brought this into being. But one thing you see is there is a lot of what were called zone change or general plan amendment. These are very complicated, kind of sometimes called spot zoning efforts to get housing built. And in 2016, there were, it's an inordinate amount because of things on the ballot, but 18,000 of them. And in 2017, 2018, when TOC comes into existence, you start to see a shift, right? Where, and you can see this in the graph as well, the city slowly starts moving away from these general plan amendment and spot zoning that had been very controversial for good and bad reasons, and toward TOC, right? To the point where, as you get to 2019, 2020, transit-oriented communities is accounting for 11,000 in 2019, so almost 7,000 units proposed, whereas these GPAs are down to just 1,000 units proposed. So it really did. I just want to sort of reinforce something that Matt said. It really did change dramatically, in some ways, the composition of development. Well, we were interested in UCLA in our work at UCLA. And I did this with Shane Phillips and Nolan Gray and Pavel Monken and all colleagues of mine. Is this issue about approval time, right? And so, to make the long story short here, long approval times for developments are a problem for developers, right? They imply higher carrying costs. They imply more uncertainty. They imply an increased risk of lawsuits or neighborhood opposition that catches the attention of an elected official who then jumps into the process and imposes more conditions, so on and so forth. And what that's going to manifest as is just more risk aversion from developers, right? And what that usually manifests as sort of just less housing being proposed, right? Because developers will be willing to bid less for land, they'll want to budget for larger returns to account for that. And so fewer projects will pencil out. And there's a long-standing idea among people who study development that part of the culprit for the long approval times is the discretionary process. And that if you do something by right, if you just let people sort of pull their permits, right, without having to go through a long process and have it be voted on, is going to be faster. And that's a pretty straightforward idea, but it's actually an idea that's been very hard to test in the past. And it's been hard to test because there's very few cities that permit similar sized projects through different pathways, right? In general, what you find is that a big project is discretionary. And so that the discretionary project might take more time, but that might just be because it's intrinsically complicated because it's large, right? And so that's always been an obstacle to really demonstrating if there is an effect between these two kinds of approval pathways. And one thing TOC did somewhat inadvertently was it changed this in Los Angeles. And I'll just give you a quick example of how it changed it. Matt alluded to this when he talked about this threshold of this project size threshold for by right and as opposed to discretionary development. So in general in LA planning law is complicated, but in general, a project over 49 units is going to trigger site plan review, which means it's going to get a discretionary review. And for TOC projects, that rule still applies, but the rule gets enforced by counting the base density and not the bonus density, right? And so, for example, if you have a TOC project that's a 40 unit base that takes an 80% density bonus, that's going to have 72 total units, right? So what that means is that even though it's over 49 units, right, which should trigger site plan review, it can still be approved by right because the base is under 49. Whereas in contrast, if you had a non-TOC project of 54 units or 72 units for that matter, it would be a discretionary review. And for that matter, if you had a TOC project that had a 60 unit base and an 80% bonus, that would probably be discretionary of you as well, because the base exceeds 49. I'm simplifying things a little bit here, but the point being is that you get sort of variance both across and within approval pathways that's based primarily on an administrative decision about when to count units toward a base. So this is the sort of thing that quantitative academics fantasize about, because it's sort of an exogenous variation that lets you isolate things. And so this is basically what we did. We divided up projects that had been approved and permitted in Los Angeles from 2018 to 2020. We looked at 348 of them and just examined the length of their approval times, right? And we looked at TOC projects that were by right, TOC projects that were discretionary, TOC projects, by right projects that weren't TOC, and discretionary projects that weren't TOC. And what you see just descriptively here is that the by right TOC projects are approved noticeably faster than the others, and that they also have a lower standard deviation, right? Which is a way of measuring, in a pretty imperfect way, but a way of measuring the uncertainty surrounding the approval time. You can also see from this table, which is just descriptives, the problem that usually comes up with doing this examination, because when you look at the non-TOC by right projects, you notice they're much, much smaller, right, than the others. Because normally to get a ministerial approval in the city of Los Angeles, you have to have a pretty small, uncomplicated project. And so these have a median unit size of only 16 compared to over 30 for the rest of them. They tend to not have any affordable units. The others tend to have more. And you can see in the bottom row, the share of projects that are 100% affordable in TOC in general, but especially in by right TOC, is quite large, right? Really contributing to these impressive numbers of below market rate units that TOC is producing. So I won't dwell on this too long, but the main takeaway that we had from this research, and we're happy to talk more about this in the Q&A or any other time really, is that if you actually dump all this into a regression analysis and control for a whole bunch of things, and I am only showing you a portion of the regression table, because showing people regression tables and slideshows is a mean thing to do because they're tedious. But if you control for a wide range of characteristics, what you see strongly suggests that actually by right approval really is associated with a faster approval time. And then in general, by right projects approved about 32% faster than a discretionary one. And in addition, the city just does a good job of fast tracking TOC projects as well. Even controlling for the approval pathway, a TOC project is approved about 25% faster than a non-TOC project. And for reasons that I'm happy to talk about, and that's in our paper, also these estimates are probably a little bit conservative. But it's just, I think it's sometimes an underestimated or an underappreciated part of TOC. I think we focus a lot on the bonuses and the regulatory relief given to developers, is how important that higher threshold for going to discretionary is, that proposition for getting a faster approval. Okay. So with that, I'm going to wrap up and stop sharing my screen, and we'll go to our final presentation before we go to a moderated discussion, which is turning this over to Laura to talk about sort of the genesis of all of this with Measure JJJ and some of the work ACT LA did.
Great, thank you. Thanks for having me. I had some slides, if I could get those up. Perfect. Yeah, thank you for inviting me on and asking to talk about the campaign. I think, one of the takeaways I want to leave folks with, especially students interested in policy work, is we can have all the best ideas, right? But until you've got the coalition and the campaign plan, it's going to be really hard to get those in place, those policy changes that are so important. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how we were able to pass the TOC policy through Measure JJJ. And it actually starts way before we got this on the ballot when ACT LA formed. So ACT LA formed 10 years ago, and it was a labor of love among grassroots community-based organizations in LA, went unstaffed for many years, and was really owed to all these grassroots orgs in Los Angeles that wanted to see change and wanted to see affordable housing near transit. And so here's the vision that those organizations came up with. They envision a transit-rich Los Angeles where all people have access to quality jobs, affordable housing, necessary social services, ample transportation options, and a voice in decision-making. Can I get the next slide? And this is the context that Act LA formed in. So we see $160 billion investment into the transit system, thanks to measures R and M. We've got new transit lines coming in, and then in the early 2010s, a lot of discussion about transit-oriented development, TOD, what's now in LA being called TOC. And there was a lot of discussion. We need to build housing near the transit lines. This is the environmental way to build a more sustainable city, which makes a ton of sense, except that there was among our members a lot of concern about who exactly is this development being geared for, right? We're seeing these new rail lines going in. We're seeing a lot of new development being proposed, but it seems to be marketed and priced for a much higher demographic than who is actually riding transit in Los Angeles. You see here the median household income for LA bus riders based on a Metro survey is a little bit more than $17,000 a year. Over 92% of Metro riders are people of color, and 10% of Black households, 11% of Latino households don't have access to a car, are transit dependent. And so Act LA really formed around this question of how do we lean into this vision of a more dense and sustainable city, but do it in a way where the policies we put into place uplift rather than displace communities of color and low-income communities in Los Angeles. And as my fellow panelists were talking about, there was development happening near transit, there was spot zoning occurring, and so we were seeing more dense development go in, and it was being approved through city council without affordable housing requirements. And so our members were really concerned and had, in the years even preceding Act LA being formed, and Los Angeles led the country in the community benefits movement. We actually, a lot of what now is happening around the country in terms of negotiations around development, getting affordable housing or other community serving amenities included in buildings, that really kind of grew out of the movement in Los Angeles. Groups like Strategic Action for a Just Economy and other folks in South LA, SICA and Chinatown were doing a lot of negotiating, and winning concessions to have more affordable housing near transit and other community serving amenities. But Act LA formed in order to have more of a citywide approach. So it wouldn't have to be these site-by-site campaigns. And so that was really where the idea of the TOC policy came from, is through, that outgrowth from the community benefits movement and forming Act LA and saying we need a campaign for a citywide approach. Can I get the next slide? And I just wanted to, share a photo. This is a member meeting, and I just wanted to highlight that everything from the idea of the policy to the details to city council advocacy. We spent a year, and we spent a year plus doing a lot of work at City Hall trying to get the policy introduced. And then finally decision to go to the ballot instead. That was all came out of meetings like this and many other meetings, as well as big community town halls, things like that, to make sure that this was grounded in the priorities and things like the idea of having an extremely low income category that Matt was talking about. That came out of the priorities we heard from the community, that we really aren't getting to the deep enough income levels through our traditional affordable housing approaches. So that needed to be a priority. Things like that really came out of these grassroots processes. And I wanted to, recognize our members, because while me and other Act LA staff have been working on the campaign with our members, it really is just, all these organizations in LA that we're a coalition of 42 organizations that really made this happen. Next slide. So what we did was, like I said, we spent a little over a year working on getting a motion introduced in city council. We were not successful in doing that. And so we ended up working with the labor movement and specifically the Labor Fed to put a measure on the ballot. And what we formed was a labor community coalition called Build Better LA. And we launched that together with the Los Angeles Federation of Labor and many of our members. So it was a joint effort. And in 2016 launched that, and that became Measure JJJ, which we put on the ballot. Next slide. And so this is where the real rubber hit the road, and we had to quickly we collected almost 100,000 signatures through, just door knocking, and we even went on to the metro trains and collected signatures, talked to transit riders about the opportunity, and we did a lot of canvassing on the buses and trains. And then we worked with our members to have people that could speak to the need for affordable housing near transit. And those were the spokespeople for the campaign. And then we spent a lot of time on voter engagement and turnout for the polls in November 2016. And we won, and we saw a huge support for this among Los Angeles voters, 64% of the vote. And then we worked on implementation with the planning department, folks like Matt Glesne, and have continued that work of making sure, which I'm sure we'll continue in the discussion today. That's a quick overview. Obviously, there's a lot more details, but I just wanted to kind of share some of the experience of getting this passed. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. That was super helpful. So all right, so let's with that that sort of stops the big overview. So let's get into a little bit of moderated discussion, and I want to start by bringing Alex in, since he's been patiently letting the rest of us hold forth, even though he's the guy who actually builds this housing. So Alex, my question to you is this: your MCAL, it does some market rate housing, but it seems to mostly do income restricted stuff. And this is, one of the big goals of TOC is to get more of this income restricted housing, especially in neighborhoods that we think have high quality transit. As a developer of this, what do you look for? What are the conditions that you look for that make it, whether they're regulatory conditions or what have you, that make you say, yeah, this is going to be feasible? And if you could then, in addition to that, speak to what it is about, is or is not about a program like TOC that can help get us closer to that goal.
All right. Without being too boring, the fact is you guys have done some good research in these areas. And I'd say one of the most important things we look for is certainty in the timeline and the financing. Because when you're doing affordable development, you have to work with multiple partners. You have lenders, you have investors, and all of those folks are looking to have some level of certainty, along with the fact that many folks have to go and get loans in order to hold land for a period of time. And if that period of time gets extended too far, then you get outside of the timeline you have for your land loans, et cetera. So, I'd say that the certainty is a big thing. I think one thing that cut against that, well, it didn't cut against the certainty, but that made it a little bit more challenging, is that as soon as TOC was approved, all the housing, all the land in those areas went up significantly. I don't know what the percentage was, maybe it's 30, 35%, but it went up dramatically. And so now in the current environment and getting bonds and 9% tax credits, it's highly, highly competitive. So it's very important for us to try and keep costs down to the extent we can. And then I think we also look at kind of from a regulatory environment, most things, are oriented toward coming up with layers of financing and satisfying multiple organizations. Obviously, the Department of Housing and Community Development for the state has been the primary agent for taking state funds and funneling them down into this environment. Now, they've been very active with transit-oriented development, And so that's been very helpful. So we've been targeting transit-oriented development for quite a while based on that fact. And it's because through the Affordable Housing Sustainability Communities Program, ASIC, they have funds that allow us to close this gap depending on how much in overall air quality reductions we're getting from the projects that we use in order to kind of subsidize those projects. Again, it still requires a great deal of certainty about when you're going to have entitlements. I can tell you that we tend to work on larger deals. It's very common for us to take a couple $1 million to fully entitle and permit a project. So having that plus the land cost sitting out there and not being able to close is a very big deal. But by right development is just critically important because I think so many groups just show up with all kinds of agendas and make the process much more difficult. And as you said, makes developers less likely to bid on something because when we look out at the landscape, we're trying to see, is council going to approve it? Who's going to oppose it? How long is it going to take, et cetera? So those become very critical issues for us. I'll just comment, I think it kind of dovetails into your next issue, that one of the things that HCD has done to try and improve ridership is by providing transit passes and as part of their funding. And so I think that's another thing that we have to look at is directly motivating those folks who are living in affordable housing communities by providing incentives to load them. I'd heard that the MTA was going to reduce the cost for affordable folks to access transit. I'm not sure what the status of that is, but I think that would be a very positive development as well.
All right, thank you. I'm gonna ask you one follow-up, and then I'm gonna throw a follow-up to Matt. And the follow-up I wanted to ask you is, you just mentioned that it's not uncommon for some of your bigger projects for the entitlement to cost $2 million.
Right.
This is something that everybody talks about. There's just another story in the LA Times about it. Like, why does this all cost so much? So I wonder if you could just take a couple minutes and just say, where's that $2 million go? Because it seems to be the question of the moment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, part of it is just, I think the more technical the process of building the project, the more expensive it becomes. So to the extent that you have discretionary approvals and they're layering on more requirements onto the project, then that's more issues that the architect, the engineer, and all those folks have to address. And so the more issues they have to address and figure out, the more expensive the project becomes. And I guess that's the net of it. And then again, if you're carrying very expensive land costs, again, and that's just the market forces. I think, again, by right development and TOC development is attractive, and the landowners who are sitting on those properties know that. And so as you increase land costs, and of course that increases some of the carry costs associated with it. And I know people don't want to hear this, but I'm going to be honest about it. Some of the things associated with TOCs or JJJ, such as requirements for project labor agreements and the level of prevailing wages, also increase the expenses. That's not so much a pre-development cost, but it definitely increases the cost of projects. So I find that we talk to council people sometimes and they say, why is this so expensive? And the answer is often, well, it's some of the things you've voted for over the last 3 years that have been layered on, and we just have to absorb those costs because every advocate has their own agenda that they want it added into this project. And obviously special needs and the various, pieces and mobility units, it just makes it considerably more complicated. It takes time to figure out.
Sure. Yes, we definitely ask a lot of new buildings in Los Angeles. So Matt, the follow-up I wanted to throw to you based on Alex's question. I mean, you talk a lot, I think, to people who are using the program. What do you hear from developers about what draws them to it, or what they think, might be an obstacle to using it?
Yeah, I think it is the just some of the transparency and sort of like risk taken out of the process, right? Like with a typical, to achieve these sorts of densities near transit, often you would need, to change your zoning or ask for certain exceptions in the prior JJJ period. And yeah, we keep hitting on it. The more discretionary it is, you really lose control, and you just don't have that certainty in the timelines, and you might get sued. And you don't know, you still have to make your case why you need that exception, and it's up to somebody else to decide. So I think it's the sort of straightforward nature of, if I provide enough affordable housing, I know with some certainty that I'm going to be able to have this many units, this much floor area of rentable space, and really not have to be concerned too much that the project's going to get derailed for something you haven't sort of planned into your budget. And so that's what I hear. It's just sort of like, it's sort of a matrix. It's like it's a little more of a checkbox. If I meet and do everything the city wants, then I know that with some certainty I could actually build my project at the end of the day. So it always comes down to certainty. I think folks can deal with costs if they know at the end of the day that they're not going to get stuck. And so it's there's obviously the buy right even more certain, but even the discretionary process is treated in such a way that there's often not a lot of surprises. We do ask for design. I'll just say that that was one thing the department felt was important, is it's not a discretionary sort of design review board process like many areas of the city have, where again you sort of don't know where you're going to end up. It's like a volunteer architect making suggestions to improve often just the look and feel and the pedestrian experience. So there's a little, cosmetic, but beyond that, the sort of number of units, the amount of floor area, the amount of parking spaces, all that can sort of be planned and very certain. And I think that is a big reason for the success. Yeah.
Great. Okay, let's now swing to something that Alex alluded to. And that certainly played a large role, I think, in Laura talking about the origins of this, which is, how do we turn this program into something that doesn't just give us the housing we desperately need, but also, gets us a shot in the arm for our transit system. And I'm gonna, I know Alex mentioned this issue that perhaps there should be, Metro should be getting more, discounted fares or free fares to people who live in affordable units. But let's talk about what might have to happen from a TOC standpoint. I think there's two ways to think about this, so I want to hear from both Matt and Laura about it. But one thing we know, just to set this up a little bit, and this will be to Matt, and then I'll go to Laura. One thing we know from a lot of research is that if you build new housing and you want people in it to use transit, one thing that really strongly predicts that is if that housing just doesn't have a lot of parking. And certainly the TOC program, one of the benefits it offers, or an incentive it offers to developers, is that they can take less parking than the city would normally require. What is your experience with developers' use of that parking incentive? Are you finding that we're seeing buildings with no parking at all, with less parking than a conventional requirement might ask for, but more than TOC asks for? Like, what's the landscape here, since this is such a important pivot in mode choice?
Yeah, and I don't have hard up-to-date data, but we did some surveys of information we do have, and it runs the gamut. I think it depends on the developer and the site and who they're sort of building for, and their vision. But certainly TOC allows more flexibility than would otherwise be available. And I think in general, and just with the highlight that I remember seeing is that in general we're closer to about, on average, about one space per unit, versus the sort of city standard had always been 2 spaces per unit. And so, roughly half. Again, it varies. I think, we have this sort of complex tier-based system where sometimes you actually have to do more than 1. Sometimes you can get away with 0.5. Sometimes we do have 0 parking in LA. Some people don't realize it's very limited. That's the tier 4, the highest tier. When you're right next to a train, we have 0 parking requirements. And we have seen some projects that are building 60, 70 units with absolutely 0 parking. And I have checked in on those. I'm really curious how those are working. And for example, there's a modular project on Crenshaw near Leimert Park. And their model was, we want sort of artists and sort of young people to be able to stay in the community, and parking is not going to be as needed. We're right next to the train station that's going to be built, hopefully soon, taking a little while. But, they were frank. They said, it's been a little bit more of a challenge to get the the tenants that are ready for this. But they've gotten there, I believe, and they are attracting, I think, that kind of no car clientele tenants that they were hoping for. I'll be honest, it takes a little more time, right? Parking, I think, is still an amenity for a majority of households in Los Angeles, and so lenders still want it, developers still view it as an amenity. So I think they still want to provide at least that one space per family, seems to be that sweet spot. But I think what it really helps do too is it, like, you don't have to build that extra podium, that extra floor of parking, of subterranean parking, which can cost millions and millions of dollars. So if you're right on the edge, you don't need to add a new floor, whereas with really strict requirements, you might. It's opened up new parcels, parcels that were kind of too small to do you need a parking ramp, and you need to turn around, and you need all these things. It's opened up a lot of parcels that really were not developable for housing, a lot of commercial sites. So I think it's had this impact. But we're not seeing a wave of everyone saying, let's do the absolute minimum. Most folks are doing a little bit more than the required. We're getting around that one space, but I think it varies. And by the way, I'll just say, like, people may not know this. There was a state law that passed and actually changed parking in these same geographies in density bonus law. So now a half mile, the same TOC geographies, if you do this TOC affordable housing, you actually now, where you're in, you can get 0.5 spaces per unit. That's just as of, I think, last year or something like that. We just put out a memo on that. So our TOC guidelines are more, maybe sometimes it's 0.5 per bedroom, sometimes it's this. It's now actually a flat 0.5 per unit, which is just brand new. And we're just sort of seeing the impacts of that as well. Just want to mention that. And then 100% affordable often does zero parking as well. And that's, I think, that we've heard that's been very helpful as well.
Great, thanks. So, Laura, you shouldn't feel yourself confined in answering this question to the parking ratio stuff that really Matt has a little bit more of a window into. But just that you brought it up, and I think it's an important question that we want to get the housing built. We want to get housing that is useful for the people who typically ride transit. But is there also a goal to just sort of have the kind of housing that, if you're there, regardless of your income, you're riding transit? Because certainly one of the things that helps existing transit riders is just having a broader swath of the population also riding transit and demanding better service and so forth. And so how do we balance that in trying to move forward with this program?
Absolutely. And I love this discussion. I think this is like exactly where we need to be talking, like all together, housing transit advocates, on how to make TOC provide that vision that it's so often billed as. I think we don't talk about the T in TOC enough, and what is happening in Los Angeles right now with our bus service is, it's a crisis, and we're going to be hemorrhaging riders if we don't fix it, right? We've got buses, people wait, like letting 2-3 buses pass if they're crowded, or buses not coming at all, canceled trips. And so we do not have a reliable service right now for transit riders. There's a lot of people that are dependent on it and have to wait, but people that don't have to depend on it are not going to use it. And I think that's just the reality that we very much as a region have to focus on transit. ACT LA has a few campaigns right now. One of them is improving bus service. And that's, of course, very related to making sure we get the labor question right, have bus drivers, be able to stay on those jobs. We also advocate for universal fare-free transit. As a region, we are the region that can do it first. We've got the sales tax that are providing most of Metro's budget. And so we advocate for that, as well as improved safety on the system and community-based safety alternatives, rather than the failed model that we have right now, which is over relying on policing. And so we are working on that, but we very much need, a lot more organizations working on improving transit in Los Angeles. Because I think until we focus on that T and TOC, we're really, going to be missing a big piece of making this vision a reality. The other couple pieces I would just point out is we do, advocate for where possible in the city. When we've got the USC study and other studies that have shown we can have more affordability in some of the TOC buildings, like that would be possible. And so we are advocating for that, especially through the community plan update, to make sure that we're not leaving affordable units on the table in that way. So I would point that out as well.
Can I just make a quick comment, Michael?
Absolutely.
Anecdotally, I can say that, but one, this is the parking requirement issue is kind of an evolutionary process. The truth is I think that when communities, and I've worked all over the state, usually they push for a lower parking capacity than is marketably feasible for the development. So we've gotten stuck in situations after 4 or 5 transit-oriented projects where, we're trying to compete to bring costs down. But then when it came to the marketability of the project, we were also trying to do mixed income. And I'm not going to try and divert us over into that entire discussion, but I'm a very firm believer in mixed income housing because I just think when you have people of different income levels, it benefits people with lower incomes even more. But when you bring in people who are higher income, like 80% AMI, which you can do through income averaging, they tend to need better, they tend to come with cars, multiple cars, and it's much harder to bring them into an affordable project that doesn't have parking. And so I think when folks say, hey, let's have zero parking, I think when unintentionally what happens is there tends to be a greater ghettoization of the process because all you can draw is people who can't afford cars. And I really don't think, and I'm certain in South LA, it's been an issue that should be a goal to just bring in 30% AMI units. And I know different people debate this, but I don't think we want to concentrate poverty. I think we want people living, in all kinds of circumstances. And I think that there will be, again, an evolution over time. It may take a decade, it may take a decade and a half. Poor people are using transit more actively. So, and again, I've got, 4 projects which are directly adjacent to transit, next to a transit line.
And what are the parking ratios?
Well, the lowest one is one in Long Beach where we're at 0.5. And that's where
Okay.
we really ended up with a challenge getting in 80% AMI folks because they had more cars. And so, of course, we had to, in order to market it, kind of designate some parking for 80% AMI folks and 70% AMI folks and provide less parking for some of the folks who were lower along the income range. But this issue keeps coming up. I think the mayor of Long Beach is a very active advocate and wanted to think about ways to have zero parking units. So it provides more flexibility, there's no question. But ultimately, we've got to support these deals, have got to rent up and have to be maintained effectively. So,
Yeah, I would almost you'd almost imagine it would be better to aim for a market rate development with very little parking. And then you'd know that that would be its own challenge. We have some in downtown Los Angeles, but you would know at least that people were selecting into that because they preferred not to own a car rather than you're just building a building for people who can't and financing that.
And it's a different situation for us. I've lived in New York as well. And the thing in New York City is you have very highly contained neighborhoods where you can do virtually everything. You can go to the grocery store, you can go to the shoe store, you can go to school, you can do all these things right in your own neighborhood. It tends to be a little bit more difficult to do that in this region. Things are just spread out more.
Right. My neighborhood in West Hollywood probably shouldn't have any parking, but
yeah,
not too many places like that. Okay. Well, let's, this sort of brings us around Laura's final point as she was talking about pushing in some of the community plans for for more affordability brings us to, I think, a broader question that I think I'd like all three of you to weigh in on, which is just that, the premise of this is that we're halfway through TOC. It's first 10-year period. And so if you just look 5 years out, what's going to happen? But I think even that is leaving a little too much time on the table, because right now we're revising community plans across Los Angeles. We're thinking about how to deal with new state housing legislation, of course, SB 9 and SB 10 being the biggest ones. And so the question I would like to pose to you is, in the next few years, or if you want to push it to 5 when the initial 10-year thing ends, that's fine too. What role will TOC play? Is it going to be, and obviously I know there's no right answer to this, but is it going to be continue to just be a big part of the development process in Los Angeles, or is it going to just help other parts of our development process evolve, right? Are aspects of it going to go into the community plans? Are we going to see something like it in light of SB 9 and SB 10 spread to other areas that aren't currently zoned by the city for multifamily development? Like where could this go and where should this go from the perspective of a planner, an advocate, and a developer? And I'll let Matt take it first, and then we'll go around.
Sure. Yeah. So I think a few things. We did just put out a housing element, a plan to House LA, as we call it, and that plan did have some detail, some thinking on where this can go. So I can share a little bit of that. But I think it was really well thought out. This is actually in JJJ. Is like this is like a bridge to the future. I think we hear this from community members. We hear this from planners that it's a bit one size. Even though we tried to differentiate it by the transit, we did a lot of things actually. Different zones get treated differently, different things scale. So we tried to build in some nuance, but planners like more nuance, communities deserve more nuance. And so that's, I think, the genius was sort of that as we do these local planning efforts that take multi-years with tons more local engagement, that we don't want to lose, transit-based incentives, and we want the good things and we want to carry them forward. But there's an opportunity through that process to sort of right-size it. Sometimes heights densities go up, sometimes they go down a little bit. Affordability levels, like Laura said, is something we can look at a micro level, and there may be opportunities in markets where those can be adjusted and right-sized. So I think that sort of right-sizing process is built into JJJ. They're going to continue to see that as plan by plan sort of figures out and essentially replaces a TOC one size with a more tailored set of transit-based incentives. I don't think transit-based incentives are going anywhere. I think transit development is still, very, very, important part of the planning of Los Angeles. Some particular other ideas, though, from like a citywide policy. I think the idea is to maybe expand and think about new types of transit. There's the Metro Next Gen, which is an amazing sort of vision of a 10-minute all-day service that often is not reflected in the definition of from 5 years ago. So can that be incorporated to, frankly, a lot of West Side areas don't have the great transit. They've lost transit, but they do have these, kind of corridors that have great service. And building on that, I think we are looking at lower density areas that today are not eligible for TOC. So somebody asked in the chat, you do have to have sort of decently multifamily zoned properties to use it. And, some of the criticism, very rightly so, is that often means redevelopment of existing RSO, rent controlled housing. That's a concern. And so, we want to have development near transit. One way to do that is build on areas that don't have rental housing, where an owner occupied is selling and nobody's being displaced. So I think there's a lot of reasons to build on the success and expand where you can use these programs without the displacement concerns. I think we're looking at stronger anti-displacement protections as part of an update to these programs. I think there are some glitches. Somebody mentioned one in the kind of how things are being interpreted and worded. I think we're looking at technical things like that. But broadly, building on the success, expanding the types of areas and the types of projects that can use these incentives.
All right, great. Laura, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I agree with a lot of what Matt just went over. I mean, certainly we need stronger renter protections citywide. I mean, not just for TOC, but I think all our incentive programs and just generally, we need to strengthen the way tenants can return to buildings after they're redeveloped, so right of return, and then looking at until we've really got something like that nailed down and it's implementable and working well, because there's a lot of challenges, of course, right, with moving tenants back in, to disincentivize use of the programs on tenant occupied sites. So, you know, some of the ideas Matt was just talking about, we're really interested in working with the city planning department on those. As I mentioned before, just looking at areas that can have more affordability. I know in the downtown LA community plans, they are looking at stronger affordability requirements and a new income category, deeply low income. So it's along the lines of what Matt was talking about. Like we have the TOC policy as kind of a baseline, but we can be learning and in community plans really tailoring it to that area of the city. So I definitely agree that, you know, robust engagement in the community plan updates is the way to go. And we just want to plug that we do have a toolkit on our website for people that are interested in getting involved in community plan advocacy that kind of explains the process and how to get involved. And then, of course, you know, just again, the connectivity to transit and making sure that in the community plan updates as well, we're looking at safer streets and all the kind of improvements to bus, bike, walkability and things that are actually going to improve our outcomes for transit use from TOC projects.
Great, thank you. Okay, Alex, last but not least, where do you think this should go?
Well, I think, again, fundamentally, the streamlined approval process is extremely important. And I think everywhere we can expand on that, whether it's transit or in communities or not, is a very positive thing to providing affordable housing. You know, we house quite a few people annually, and I think sometimes people are not clear about what people's preferences are. So it's not that easy to fill and talk to an investor about it, to fill a building that's got a certain percentage of 80% units and then have homeless units in that same building. A lot of those folks have greater set of options, and so they're going to elect not to live in a building where there are homeless tenants, as an example. So I think we got to look at that nuance and not just kind of say, you know, we have these utopian goals that aren't connected to the marketplace where we actually have to go and work on a daily basis. And I'll say something that's, I guess, unusual that I would really love to see, and I'm not sure how it can be implemented, but some level of liability protection for some developers in certain circumstances. So you have the CEQA process, but then you also have some community groups that come and folks who advocate on behalf of community groups who sue really just deep-pocketed developers in order to get to their insurance proceeds. And I had a project that was delayed a fair amount for exactly that reason. They wanted, our insurance coverage was for $1 million for that project. That's what they wanted. They started by suing us for $18 million. We ended up settling, whatever, 9 months later for $1 million. So, you know, there are people in this process who are just attaching themselves to it. And this was, by the way, on a project where we relocated all the tenants, paid them the maximum amount for permanent relocation. And also mentioned that, you know, these developments typically take a minimum in the city of Los Angeles 3 years to do. You do not get a lot of tenants return after that kind of period of time. So I've been involved in 3 and 4 years. You know, you can go out. I gave everyone a right to return. You just don't have a lot of folks. They've resettled to other places, sometimes in completely different areas, especially when they've been paid relocation payments that are substantial. So.
Let me ask you a quick follow-up, Alex, and then I'm going to follow up with everybody to see if someone wants to chime in on a separate note. You mentioned earlier that one thing that happened to you, or that you observed when TOC happened, was that the land costs rose substantially. So my question to you is, if one potential future of TOC is that it spreads to cover a lot more area, is there a chance that that would calm some of these land costs? Because one of the issues right now is that these scarce sites that qualify for this bonus, now everybody goes for them and chews into your tax credit subsidies. So could you have a calming effect on the land costs by just sort of generalizing this across more of the city?
Yes, I would think so. Absolutely. I mean, so because in those corridors, I mean, again, prices went up extravagantly. I mean, they went up a great deal. And so, yeah, I think that would have an impact. And the more broad spread it is, and the more options we have in terms of looking at prospective properties, then, the more folks have to compete to sell them. So, yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay, great. So the follow-up I wanted to pose to everyone, because I noticed that this is probably just the fault of me not asking the question well, is that nobody mentioned when I asked about the future of this, and now the more I think about it, it was my fault the way I phrased the question. Nobody mentioned this spilling over LA's borders, right? But do we see a potential for this to become state legislation? Do we see a potential for this to get imitated? Laura or Matt in particular, have you had counterparts or partners in Beverly Hills or Culver City asking you about how do we implement this in our communities? I mean, could this go not necessarily maybe big time, but just get into more of the county? And whoever wants to take a stab at it, I won't call on one end.
I certainly think so. On the county level, I mean, one thing I would point to is, obviously every city would have to implement its own land use program, but the Metro, as kind of this regional agency that has a TOC policy now, will be doing implementation of the TOC policy. So Metro basically, in 2018, I believe, passed a policy that set out its goal for affordable housing near transit all around the county. Money now, the transit money, can be used for affordable housing and tenant protection activities because of the interplay with housing and transit. And so through the implementation process, they're now going to be working with cities, city by city, along transit lines to update their housing policy. And I think that's a huge opportunity to do more incentive programs like this around the county and improve tenant protections. I mean, a lot of places in the county have very little, if any, strong tenant protection policies. And so we worked on that at Metro for a while and worked on the implementation plan, and it hasn't quite started rolling out yet, but I think that's a huge opportunity.
Yeah, that sounds great.
I would just mention that, again, because HCD has now had an ongoing transit-oriented program, I think that people outside the city of Los Angeles do still look at transit. It depends on being adjacent to transit. Depends on how dense the area happens to be, obviously, on your ability to perform in that respect. But yeah, I think it would be a very positive thing to have programs like this around the state. Again, some places it's a better fit than others, because you really, again, you have to have a certain, like I looked at it out in the Colton area, and we just had a difficulty generating the level of density out there that we needed to really have an impact.
Makes sense. Matt, anything you want to add? Have you heard from your counterparties in some of your neighboring cities about trying to do anything like this, or radio silence?
No, we get interest. We do have conversations with other cities. I'm not sure where they're at in it. I would imagine we're going to see a lot of this with the housing element. Just that's where my mind's been at the last week. So you may know, but it's a real law that is going to have real impacts and force cities to do some rezoning and be creative about where they put new housing. And I think the first inclination is always in our good transit areas, and so I would not be surprised if we see a lot of sort of transit-based planning and rezoning and incentive programs crop up here in the next 1 to 3 years, as cities are going to be on the hook or they lose their affordable housing dollars. So there's a real, these often were paper laws, I would think in some ways, these housing element laws, they are very real, as we and everyone else are finding out. And the state is paying close attention, and they expect action and rezoning in a way that furthers fair housing, in a way that is done sustainably and equitably.
Okay, great. And that's actually you just, I think, Matt, you just inadvertently segued us into the last part of our program, which we've been keeping an eye on the Q&A. So in the last few minutes, some questions from the audience. And I think you just spontaneously answered the first one I was going to ask, which was a question from, I'll credit Justin Magan, who just asked, how might TOC be used or adapted to hit the new state housing production mandates? And I think you've covered a little bit of that ground, but if you want to, if there's anything to add, if you think there's something in particular you're going to do to expand it to hit these targets, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, I refer people to our housing element. We have a rezoning plan for 1.4 million new rezoned units. Not that I can tell everyone that is what is going to end up being the number, the actual rezoning, but we did put out a plan that could achieve that, and there are multiple subcomponents of that, and you'll see it in chapter 4. One of it is TOC expansion, and one of it is expand along our corridors and these new definitions of transit. So some of the things I mentioned, that certainly building on the success is a core part of what we see as a rezoning moving forward. There's many other components, but yeah, without rehashing my previous answer, I'd say it's in the housing element. Yes, definitely building on this is an important part of our rezoning strategy.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, so now two people asked questions along the following lines, which is basically, have there been or will there be regulatory updates to improve design standards for projects to basically contribute more to walkability, and with a particular interest in standards for by right projects that might not otherwise be subject to that kind of design review. And I'll just add, this is a great question, because I think the focus on transit is always very understandable, but a transit-friendly neighborhood is a walkable one, right? I mean, it's almost every transit trip starts with a walk trip, and people who use transit a lot also walk a lot. And so this really can become a missing link when we do transit-oriented development. So I guess the question is probably most naturally goes to Matt, but if anyone else wants to chime in on this, please feel free.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great insight. The by right projects today, while there's a lot of obvious good things about that, it does mean that you sort of meet the very basic requirements in the building code and the zoning code, and you're good. And that may mean things are lacking from a pedestrian, a site design, connecting to the transit station, things that a planner through a discretionary process may highlight and improve upon a project. Those do get lost. So I think one big answer that I think the city planning department is looking at is more objective design guidelines, as well as a completely revamped zoning code. We've been talking about it probably for 8 years now. Recode LA, as we update each community plan, it comes with a brand new zoning code for the 21st century, and those principles of walkability, pedestrian first, climate adaptation, those are all now being kind of coded in. So every project has sort of, I think, a higher level of expectations around these really important issues, and we could still have them go by right. So I think that's sort of the way the city of Los Angeles is approaching that. I know there's a new initiative, Healthy Buildings, Healthy LA, our urban design studio is also really looking at these issues in terms of these new objective design guidelines. So stay tuned.
Great, thank you. Any of our other panelists want to weigh in on that, or shall we take another question? All right, let's take another question. Let's see here. I'm now scrolling through. Well, so here's a question that I think is a little bit vague, but might be worth talking about, which is can you address some of the lawsuits that have been filed against TOC? Obviously, these lawsuits have had different motivations. The big one, I think, probably came from Fix the City, but there were some others as well. But let's talk about that. I think when transit-oriented communities first became quote unquote controversial is probably when the Fix the City organization filed a suit against it. What was the basis for that? And as different people who work in this area, talk about what that sort of lawsuit means. To the extent you can. I mean, Matt, I don't know if you can talk about litigation, but what do these lawsuits and the presence of these lawsuits tell us about the program and maybe just our effort to try and build a more affordable Los Angeles?
I can take a try that one. I mean, I don't think that lawsuit was a surprise. I think we all expected it, right? And that came on the heels of the same kind of group of people putting Measure S on the ballot. And so there's a movement in Los Angeles to stop affordable housing, to stop more dense development, to keep a very low zone city. And that's exactly where Measure S came from, is kind of this pushback against our collective movement to make a more dense, sustainable city, more transit friendly, more transit generally. And so we were all expecting that lawsuit. And I don't think it has many legs to stand on. I mean, maybe Matt can talk more about that, but yeah, that, but the good news is Measure S was very soundly defeated. We know that is not the majority opinion in Los Angeles. And we talked a lot. We actually worked on the No on S campaign as one of the campaign leads. And we talked to a lot of voters through that process. And that is not a view that represents the vast majority of people in the city. So that's the good news.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I think we won that lawsuit. I don't know. I'm not up on all of our lawsuits. There's so many lawsuits.
Yeah.
I think we won. So yeah, they were looking, they were obviously, yes, I think it came from the place that Laura describes, but obviously they were throwing things that we abused our discretion, that we went further than JJJ. We went rogue when we created these tiers and these different set of incentives and things like that. And so, yeah, I think it was heartening to see a court recognize that was not the case. I think they still they did ding a project, that something on earthquake issue. So I think there's still maybe something going on with a particular project, but I think the major challenge for the program is behind us.
I guess, Alex, just the issue, it just speaks to something you brought up earlier, which is one of the great sort of tail risks that hangs over anyone who does these developments is that at some point someone could sue you, and depending on how it goes, everything could be turned upside down.
You know what? The truth is, I think under many circumstances, there's much less risk of everything being turned upside down, as opposed to someone saying, I'm going to take a cut of whatever's going on over here by putting a lawsuit together. And again, knowing that you can't sit and play games with somebody for 3 or 4 years with the lawsuit, that you've got to figure out a way to settle it. And even as someone who's been trained as an attorney, it's very difficult for me to see that be a part of the process. And again, even though it may sound crazy to ask for some level of liability protection, these things delay projects. And I think maybe within the context of, if you've abided by certain established city rules associated with TOC and tenant relocation, the various elements, that group can't just pop up and just sue you because they want a piece of the action. And that's, again, what I find the most common, not people who have a genuine issue, but folks who just want to help fund their group.
Yes, I suppose
I know
so.
it seems cynical, but
it's hard to believe that there are cynical actors.
You do enough of these deals, and unfortunately, yeah.
Okay. Yes. Well, I'm willing to believe there are cynical actors in the Los Angeles land use space. So let me, we're getting close, but let me pose what may be a final question, depending on how long it takes to answer. This came up briefly in the Q&A. It also came up prior to in the planning of our event. And the basic question is, we've got a lot of TOC units entitled. Just wondering how many of them have started construction. And so one of the questions that came up was just that question. As we've discussed as a panel, we also have seen some data from Maria.ai, which is a newish sort of the development information company, suggesting that maybe 75% of the entitled TOC units haven't gotten underway yet. And so just, we could talk about that particular issue, but of course it's not unique to TOC that not everything that gets entitled gets built. But just a broader question of like, it is hard to entitle things, or it can be hard to entitle things. We really need housing. What can we do to make sure that when things are entitled, they get built from any angle, from the angle of the developer, the city, the advocacy community, whoever wants to go first and
I'll
can.
just mention this one factor just very quickly.
Sure.
In this time, materials costs have exploded. So it's easy to imagine that folks have gotten into deals that they can no longer pencil. Again, you're looking at a 2-year range. I have a deal that I just got information on in May from my contractor. The framing costs alone went up $2 million since last May. So, you have enough of these framing, steel, lumber, enough of these issues come up, and it's very easy to make something not viable. We don't know exactly what's going to happen with the whole Russia-Ukraine situation and how it affects supply lines, but I do think that some of the supply channel issues probably had a big effect on that. I just know that anecdotally, I can tell you it's had an effect on us for sure.
Absolutely.
So timing issue sometimes, as opposed to just a decision to go or not go.
Sure.
Yeah, no, I think that I think explains a lot of this, is that you have a pro forma when you submit, and then things change, and then you got to go get your construction loan, and it's just the loan is not there. The numbers don't add up for many reasons. Materials the forefront. So yeah, I'm not sure this is an issue unique to TOC. I mean, we were surprised. We in the city planning department, I think we've approved something like 50,000 units in 5 years. I mean, just an insane, very large amount of units being approved and not seeing that turn up in permits across the board. So I think, yes, this and so I think cost shifting is a big part of that. I think there are these people that they have land and they flip it, right? There's that happening as well, is that they never intended to buy it. The plan was always to get it ready to issue and ship it off, and then maybe the price isn't right. I think there's a lot of that going on. Again, all projects. I'm not sure it's unique to TOC, but it is something. I mean, we are approving units. We would love to see these get built. I would love to dig more into this. I would love to say, look, if you're close, is there something state, city, somebody can get you over the hump and make that project viable? You've gone this far. I hate to have you start over. So I think this is an interesting topic for further research, and I'd really turn to experts to how can the city support, how can government support, how can we make sure that housing that's gone through actually gets built, particularly when it's near transit and including extremely low income units.
Probably means more money.
Money is not the solution to every problem, but it does solve a lot of problems.
There's just not an infinite supply of it out there.
Yeah. Laura, I wanted to give you the opportunity if you wanted to weigh in on that one. I know it's not as squarely in your wheelhouse, but.
Well, I'll take the opportunity, since we're talking about the need for revenue, to just plug that we are the housing movement and labor movement are working on a new ballot initiative called United to House LA. They've got a website, unitedtohousela.com. And it's a massive opportunity to raise the revenue and invest at the scale needed in homelessness prevention, tenant protections, and affordable housing. Because as we've just mentioned, revenue is critical for so many of these things, including working with tenants like we've been talking about today, and building the affordable housing we need near transit. So we're collecting signatures as we speak. We're looking for volunteers. Folks can go to that website and check it out. So thanks for letting me plug that website.
Absolutely. Okay, and with that, I think we are at 1:58, and so I am going to declare that we have a 2-minute surplus and wrap this up. I really want to thank the 3 panelists who I think just created a lot of thoughtful and informative discussion around this topic. I want to thank all the unseen staff at the Ziman and Lewis Centers who helped make this possible. And of course, I want to thank all the audience who came, albeit remotely. One day we will, I promise, we'll all get back together at UCLA as humans and see each other. But in the meantime, thank you for your Zoom attentiveness, and hopefully we'll see you at the next Housing Equity and Community series. So thanks a lot, everybody. I hope everybody has a great day.
Thank you for the opportunity to participate.
Thank you all. Talk to you soon.